Now, it's important to understand that the distinctions I'm making when we talk about art versus craft are distinctions that aren't necessarily made everywhere. So, culture or cultural context, what the culture says is important, and where and when that is. So, culture can be something, we live in a 21st century American kind of Western culture. But different parts of the world, different times have different ideas about what's important in their culture and stuff. So here we have a distinction that we're making between craft and fine art. But for example, in Japan, as an example, not the only one, there really isn't nearly as much distinction made between, okay, this is craft, or this is fine art, or at least I should say there may be distinctions made. They aren't, they tend to favor ceramics. So a lot of handmade ceramics in this country has for a long time been considered kind of craft, not fine art, but functional stuff made by, local potteries, but they're kept kind of separate. So the Virginia School of Folk Pottery, folk meaning it's kind of this other thing than fine art, even though it's functional, it's beautiful, it's handmade, it's made by skilled makers, right? Whereas here on the other side, we have a tea bowl. And of course, this one's a bit older, but tea ceremony in Japan has attached a lot of significance to tea bowls, and tea bowls made by really highly respected makers. And so I spent a little bit of time in Japan when I was in college. And one of the things that was really interesting is my host family would bring out their ceramics and say, let's talk about who made this, right? I lived in a ceramic like village, and the stores there had tea bowls made by contemporary folks, not stuff from 1600, that were selling for thousands of dollars, right? And it was just sort of a higher respect for it. Now, part of that is because of the Japanese tea ceremony, and so the tea ceremony puts a lot of emphasis on this process, the materials for the tea ceremony. So really, the one would be this tea bowl, the ceramic tea bowl. Other materials are lacquer or metal or wood, but the tea ceremony lends a lot of weight, and so that the highly respected makers of tea bowls are viewed as artists and are viewed as this kind of high level, right? That also tends to kind of trickle down to some of the other objects made out of ceramics. But the other is an expectation that, a lot of the stuff you eat off of at home, at least until fairly recently, would be handmade, would be ceramic, handmade ceramic, lacquer, things like that. Whereas in our culture, recently in particular, we have a lot of mass production. Now, there's more mass production, of course, creeping in all around the world. But it means that the history has been a little bit different. Now, other parts of the world, different times, we've had different balances of that. And I'm just going to show you a couple of more recent, just a couple times. So this is Martin Brothers from England. And one of the things that's interesting here is these guys were selling, not obviously 1870s to 1923, there wasn't a lot of, styrofoam and plastic cups. There wasn't that kind of competition of that kind of mass-produced work. These guys had kind of a part where they were a pottery, but they weren't mass producing in the way we saw some of the other, like the Wedgwood above. These had a lot more handcrafting going into them. But they're right on the line between kind of folk art, and now they're probably more, more expensive, more collectible. But you can see the real artistic expression going into these. So these would be more one of a kind. Obviously, they did replicas and stuff like, multiples of the same kind of idea, these face jugs and these birds and stuff like that. But also, it was these three guys, right? It wasn't, and they may have had folks working with them, but it wasn't a sort of full assembly line kind of setup. in the U.S., we've got George Orr, who's quite a character. I highly recommend reading about him, looking into his stuff. But he went by the Mad Potter of Biloxi, and check out that mustache. But his work was all handmade, all thrown pottery. It basically just him. And his work was very whimsical, very fun. And what's interesting is that what I find particularly interesting is that he actually had a terrible fire that destroyed his workshop and like all of his work at one point. And when he started making work afterward, he said, "I'm not selling this. I don't want to sell this because it's really important that I hang on to this stuff and that I keep track of it because I'm going to be famous." And people are going to want to put this in a museum. And just like that level of confidence in your own work is impressive. He's also correct. He has his own museum now. And so you can go see a lot of the work that made it, right, that didn't get destroyed. His stuff is mostly wheel thrown, although he has a lot of sculpted elements as well. This one's actually a puzzle mug, so there's a hollow part essentially inside, and there's a way you have to like plug up the holes in a particular way to be able to drink out of it without dribbling. Those kind of joke pottery. There were a lot of his work had kind of jokes and things like that built into it. But that sort of work is, is it art? I mean, now we look at it as art, but at the time it was really seen a little bit more as craft or folk art, kind of lower level, even though really skilled and really, thoughtful kinds of stuff, which is why the distinction is a little bit silly. So coming into the middle of the 20th century, and here I'm focusing on the West, so I'm focusing really specifically in the US and the UK to some extent. So here we have, middle of the 20th century, we have the abstract expressionists, folks like Jackson Pollock, and big wall paintings. You've seen his drip paintings, right? This is him on the cover in 1949. The abstract expressionists really making fine art. This is art to be looked at. This is not, it's not a picture of anything. It's not got any other function, right? Whereas across the pond, Bernard Leach is making Japanese-inspired pottery, very much about function. About a functional form. Now, would you buy a Bernard Leach vase and actually stick a flower in it? Not now, you wouldn't. It's too expensive. But the focus was on making these functional forms in the history of ceramics rather than in the history of fine art making, art for art's sake, which you might call the abstract expressionist painters at the time. So that's kind of the dichotomy, really strong distinction. You're not going to see ceramics in art museums at this time or in art museums of the time. Now, around this time, along comes Peter Voulkos, who is a sort of iconoclastic artist at the time because he's a ceramicist, but he basically takes the ceramics and says, it's fine art. I'm an abstract expressionist. I'm using the potter's wheel as a tool, just like Jackson Pollock is using the paint bucket as a tool, and the canvas the clay is my canvas, right? And this is a big deal at the time, and it's important for ceramic artists if you start to get into any history of ceramics. You probably go to Japan, you probably go to China, and at some point you need to learn about Peter Voulkos and the other folks who are essentially in the abstract expressionist vein working with clay. But you're not going to see these guys in the book, in an art history book, where a lot of the focus is going to be on metal sculpture, maybe some combined, mixed media objects, and paintings, because the ceramics really was this separate world at the time. But for the ceramic world, this was a big deal that Voulkos was using the wheel to make things that were not strictly functional. Now, folks like Don Reitz comes along behind him. I got to include Don Reitz because though he was an important abstract expressionist guy, he also founded the program. Really was a founder of the ceramics program at Madison, which is where I got my MFA. So, got to give a nod to that. And his work is often functional, but really with the idea of the plate being a place to express himself, or with these, the platter being a painting surface. These guys, you notice, are working on the wheel, but really thick chunks of clay. Voulkos chops things apart and puts them back together. Reitz does some of the same, also works kind of with really wet, thick pieces of clay. And in that vein, we have folks like Paul Soldner. Paul Soldner we sometimes talk about when we're on campus because he kind of founded, so they say, Western raku, which is really different to Japanese raku, but essentially just playing with fire. But again, here we've got the clay. Here is the material, but this doesn't have to be clay, right? There's nothing about this pedestal piece that says, okay, you couldn't make a similar form out of some other material. And so ceramics starts getting used for essentially the first time as this purely expressive sculptural medium. And then you have somebody like John Balistreri, who is working very, very large scale works, as you can see by the figure in the back there. And again, working, it could be metal, it could be, some other material. It's ceramic. Because that's the tool that works, but not because of any of the history of it being used for functional kinds of purposes.